Well, thank you so much for coming. It's great to see this crowd here. My name is Marie Lowe, and I'm a faculty member here at ISER. And I had to go all the way to Tromsø, Norway, actually, to meet a fellow Alaskan and today's speaker, Jen Schmidt. I had been invited to sit on a colleague student's thesis committee there, and was asked to present on some of the research that we do here. And I met Jen at that forum, and we started talking about interdisciplinary research in the circumpolar north, and she's really a pro. And I invited her to come and give us a talk when she was next in town, and here she is. She's going to tell us about really an interesting project she's working on with a circumpolar team. Looking at governance and societal impacts on subsistence and land use. And I told her this morning when I picked her up from the airport that we were really in there. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn at those of us at UAA who are interested in either pushing forward a current Arctic research agenda or developing one in terms of the challenges and the opportunities with interdisciplinary research in this context, and also I think that there's a lot of other things that we can learn from the things that she's been doing, especially in terms of recent work in codifying subsistence data sets here in Alaska, which we all know and love from ADFG, and I think that there's a lot that she can share. What I'd like to ask is that everybody hold off on your comments and questions until the end of her talk, and then we can really get into it in about 45 minutes. So without further ado, can you help me welcome Jen Schmidt?
I want to say thank you for everyone coming. I did my graduate work at UAF and graduated from there in 2007 with the what was called the IGERT program at that time, so it was an interdisciplinary education program. And as a postdoc, I worked with Terry Chapin, who helped put me in connection with this project. The project I'm going to talk about is primarily, the main PIs are Norwegians because Norway has a lot of money. So it's called the Tundra Project, and it's drivers of change in circumpolar tundra ecosystems. I did have in here more information about kind of the governance component, which we did interviews about, but my talk is already pretty long, so some of that had to be scaled back. But when I get back from Norway, I could come and give another talk. So participants, here in Alaska, it's myself and Terry Chapin. And Canada, this is an international project, so it involves Alaska, Canada, Norway, and Russia, and focuses in the tundra region. So at UAF, those myself and Terry Chapin, Canada, Douglas Clark, and Niels. And Niels is actually going to be over in Tromsø in Norway when I go over there. I'm leaving for Norway tomorrow to spend 6 months over there so that we can work on analyzing the interviews that we did. In Norway, the leads are Vera, Per, and Margrethe here. She's the economist among our group, and Else, and she primarily deals with Sami studies. And then in Russia, Dorothy and Konstantin. Konstantin is pictured up there on his reindeer, and he's from St. Petersburg. So for my talk, I'm going to go into the project background. The first part is going to be on social economic data and a paper that resulted from that. That's going to be the majority of my talk. And then part two is interviews, and then some preliminary results from those interviews, just some general comments, and then the future. So the background of the Tundra Project, it's an interdisciplinary study that attempts to link social and ecological disciplines, explore how anthropogenic drivers influence land use, subsistence, and ecosystems. And since the Arctic is a region that's going through rapid change and anthropogenic pressure from oil and gas, this is a real important area to study. The picture there is of like a caribou crossing up on the North Slope, and then over here is area in Russia. And how did we select our study area? Well, we basically looked at an biomes map and looked for the tundra regions here. The talk about the social economic paper is going to include 18 regions, so it's going to include several of these regions, whereas the interviews were only Russia, Norway, Canada, and Alaska. But this map was used to help select the communities that we did interviews in. So goals: cross-disciplinary analysis aimed to identify drivers of change in the circumpolar tundra ecosystem. Understand how government and socioeconomic conditions are drivers of ecosystem states and services. And then a comparative analysis among Norway, Canada, Russia, and Alaska. And if I'm going too fast, let me know. I have a habit of doing that. So from a theoretical framework, we have environmental governance, and we have socioeconomic conditions kind of feeding into harvest land use. Originally, the Norwegians wanted to look at pollution, but it was so big already in time. So we focused on harvest and land use and how that affects ecosystem change and local important ecosystem services. So by large-scale regions like environmental governance, I kind of pulled these from Fish and Game and also the Alaska Constitution and then the Norway Land Act. Alaska common use is, important. I must have hit some crazy button. So common use, maximum use, and then in Norway, more about protection and well-being for humans, animals, and plants. Small scale, that would be the communities, and these are just some phrases from the interviews that I conducted. I did interviews in Norvik and Breivik Mission, and then also Noatak and Atkasuk. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation. Get rid of all the bears and wolves, but then also conservation. As far as socioeconomic conditions go, pretty wide-ranging. Alaska, more free market, entrepreneurial. Norway, social economic equality is really important. Like in Norway, it's written into their laws that like people in the north pay just about as much as for people in the south. So for like prices of gas, prices of food, you don't see the big price disparity. And then Russia's kind of a collapse and reorganize with the end of the Soviet Union. And small communities, things like dividends, access to waged labor, connectivity, like can the areas get freight planes in, stuff like that. So research questions. How do environmental governance and socioeconomic conditions influence ecosystems and the services they provide to local people? What do the results imply with regard to implementation of ecosystem-based management in circumpolar tundra ecosystems? And how effective is spatial ecosystem analysis for understanding the linkages between management approaches, ecosystem change, and the resources local people depend on? One of the reasons that I got into this project too is there is a GIS component, and I do a lot of GIS work. So some local questions. How does the use of the landscape differ among communities in the circumpolar tundra? I thought it would be helpful for people in rural Alaska to learn what happens in other areas of the Arctic, in Russia. How do they use the land? What are some coping mechanisms that they have? What strategies or circumstances among the tundra communities result in local voices being heard? And what about government helps or hinders subsistence harvest? So time frame, project started back in 2009. And so through 2009, I reviewed previous subsistence literature and projects that had been done. The first part of the first phase was Norway, Russia, and Canada were to look at existing data and build a database on harvest, kind of animal population sizes and trends, and also a management database. So I spent about a year going through subsistence harvest data and building this database. It included like about 11 other or about 8 other animals. The person in Canada kind of fell through. It's kind of working, in such a large area and interdisciplinary. It's kind of hard to get people committed to a project, especially when you're not paying them. So, but this has resulted in a paper that is soon to be submitted that deals with governance in the wildlife governance in the Arctic. So then, from 2010 to 2013, I'm going to present this socioeconomic paper that we were working on. So the theory of this paper is that social and economic systems are interlinked and should be studied together. And we're really interested in this demo-economic system. It focuses on economic consequences of population change, and this is the paper that this concept came from, that we pulled it from. And I have a little example of kind of a demo economic system that I put together. So basically you have, like, say an example, an industry closes. Well, this has fallout for unemployment rates and also migration, so human population. And if out-migration, say, increases from an industry closing, you can have skewed sex ratios. It affects the growth rate. Schools close. And I mean, if people are moving away, you have less support for the local economy. People are buying fewer things, and less attractive to business. So it's all interconnected. So the goals of this paper were to identify similarities and differences among the regions in the Arctic, to better understand driving forces and key indicators, and examine whether large changes or fluctuations in labor and consumption markets result in more variation among demographic indicators. And I'll be going into what those indicators were. So this is the study area. We looked at 18 different regions in the Arctic. Of course, number 1, starting with Alaska here, and then going around Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and Russia. And the reason that this scale was chosen, because this was the smallest scale where we could find all the data that we needed. A lot of this project went into collecting and finding this data, which was a big effort. And I'm pushing for the data to be publicly available once the paper gets accepted, because I think it can be used for other things too. So we used a multi-factor analysis on 10 indicators to characterize the economic and demographic conditions of 18 regions over 14 years. A multi-factor analysis is kind of like a PCA, but we have time series data, so that's why we use the multi-factor analysis, because it can incorporate the time series data. And this is the Icelandic currency, and our data stopped at 2008, so before the huge crash that occurred over there. We actually contacted some people in Iceland to get the data, and they told us most of their colleagues had moved to Norway. So the multi-factor analysis, the goal of a multi-factor analysis is to find common structure present in all or some of the variables. We use it to analyze a set of observations described by several groups of variables. So we had, a wide range of the types of variables that we were collecting, from, natural growth rates to income. And it's like a PCA in that it uses eigenvalues and principal components on each data set, which is then normalized by dividing all its elements by the square root of the first eigenvalue obtained from PCA. So basically it's just kind of, it tries to group data and pull out which of the indicator variables explain most of the correlation. So we weighted countries so that countries with more regions did not have greater influence. We took the log to achieve a more normal distribution if that was necessary. And then we counted the number of times that a correlation coefficient was correlated with a principal component. So if that indicator was correlated with that axis more than 50%, more than 0.5, then it was counted, and you'll see that in the figures. And then we were interested in the variation in the data among the regions. So the parameters. The 10 parameters we looked at, we have population density, growth rate, migration. Then we have over here unemployment rate, income purchasing power parity, fuel purchasing power, and I'll go into what these mean, and then percent employment in the public sector, service sector, and goods sector. These here add up to 100, so 100%. So when we did our MFA, we left the service sector had to be left out because they're related to each other. Population density and growth, that's an attempt to look at population connectivity, remoteness, and the labor force, kind of a age structure. So like with a rapidly growing and high natural growth rate, you would expect a younger population. Income PPP, that was total income encompassing wages, transfers, and it was converted to US dollars by the use of a PPP index. Fuel PPP, this we got the fuel prices for each of the regions and then divided it by the income for the regions. So the currencies canceled out, so it's just, you know, an indicator. It does not take into account dependency on fuel. I contacted ISER to see if there was such information, because just within Alaska, for example, the North Slope has access to natural gas, whereas areas in the Northwest Arctic, you know, use a lot of diesel. So I think that's one way that, you know, for the future, you know, something like this could be improved if we could find the data. But then again, if we have it for Alaska, I don't know if we'd have it for all 8 other regions. But I think it's important. Participation rate. This looks at the number of individuals working or looking for work among the total number of persons of working age. So it's different than what the unemployment rate is. Whereas the unemployment rate just looks at the number of individuals employed among the labor force. So you can have the unemployment rates obviously look like they're going down, but it's just people dropping out of the workforce. So these kind of get at 2 slightly different issues. Data sources, like I said, a lot of work went into collecting that, and I contacted people here and all around the state. With a project like this, it's very helpful to have people who, say, can speak and read Russian, because some of the Russian papers came on paper and had to be interpreted. Kind of like the governance paper that we worked on, one of the lead authors, he can read multiple different languages. So he got a lot of his information from like gray literature, which most people wouldn't have access to. So, and ArcStat was a database that was useful. So this is an example of what the data all looked like. This here, I'll come back to it, it's the ranks. So on the top you have our different indicators, and in orange are the Alaska regions, and you have them ranked. So what I did is I took the average over the years and ranked them from high down to low. So like with population density here, Murmansk had the greatest population density, and the darker colors here, these would be like Norway, Iceland, Finnmark, and the white is your Russian regions. So it was just a way to look at how these rank and how they compare to our MFA analysis, which this is the result of the first 2 axes in the MFA analysis. And since there's a lot going on here, I'll go kind of slow. It explained 53% of the variation. And what this analysis does is it finds the indicators that explain most of the variation, and as you go on to the other axes, there's less and less variation that is explained. So the first axis here explained about 32% of the data, and it goes across this way. So on the negative side over here, population density was correlated above 0.5%, 14 out of 18 regions. So population density really explained the clusters down over in here. You have Russia and you have Norway, high population density. On this side here, you have regions with a high natural growth rate. So you have Wade Hampton, the rest of Alaska communities, and Canada regions over here. So here's an example of the population density. By far, the regions this is in Russia, and these are two regions in Norway. They're a lot higher than any other regions. Alaska and Canada are way down here. So that really explained this cluster. And the natural growth rate is also 14 out of 14. So the natural growth rate, this is where I took the average of the communities and I ranked them. I just sorted them. And you can see that a lot of the Alaska regions have the very high natural growth rate. Only Murmansk had a negative natural growth rate. But all the regions in Russia tend to be on the lower side. Another factor that was very important was unemployment, with again 14 out of 14. And on this side, that means higher unemployment rates on this side compared to this side. And when you look at unemployment rates, you can see that Alaska has high unemployment rates compared to Iceland and Norway and Finnmark. Even Russia, has lower unemployment rates. And I think, these unemployment rates are actually much lower than what you see out in the villages. With my interviews, I went out and, saw what goes on in village life, and I would put unemployment more around 50%, but this is what, the data says. And of course, unemployment, you have to be, looking for work in the labor force. So, dimension 2 explained 21% of the variation, and the driving force with dimension 2 is income. So North Slope is way up here with its income, as you'll see on the next slide, and also fuel is high. Communities up here have high income and high fuel purchasing power. So this is ranked again, income. You'll notice Russia is extremely low with their income. North Slope has the highest income out of all 18 regions. And one thing to note on this is the diversity that just occurs within Alaska. I mean, Alaska is almost like comparing different countries. And that really surprised people in Norway. And with Russia, on the stuff that I read and I talked to some people there, Russia really has a strong underground economy. I mean, some of the papers I was reading, over half of the people who are working aren't working in the formal economy. So I'm guessing that's what I think is going on with this. Fuel purchasing power. So that is higher fuel purchasing power, that the income is greater compared to the price of fuel. Greenland is high here. Greenland is heavily subsidized by Denmark. So we couldn't find any direct information about that, but rather other than just in papers they say Greenland is highly subsidized by Denmark. They're trying to become fully independent, but not yet. North Slope was again pretty high, and then Russia is low again. And when you look more into this fuel purchasing power, this here, you can see Alaska's really been hit hard by the increase in fuel prices. It's just plummeted. Whereas the Russian regions are going in the opposite direction. Their fuel purchasing power is actually going up. And I wanted to figure out, fuel purchasing power is part income and part price of fuel. So what's going on here? So when I looked into it, both places the price of fuel is going up. Alaska a lot more. But the thing that differentiates the two is the income is going up much more rapidly in Russia than what it is in Alaska. I mean, you go from 500 to 3,500, so like sevenfold increase. And here, I'll take a doubling of my income, but it's the rate of increase is much less than what's going on in Russia. Okay, and One thing that both of these axes have in common is participation. So the percent of people participating in the workforce, and participation rates in Greenland, Iceland, Norway region, they're pretty high. The North Slope is very high, and I mean, again, it differentiates from the rest of the regions in Alaska. But, all right, so on to axis 3 and 4. So axis 3 and 4 explain an additional 28% of the variation. So let's see, 28. In total, that's around 78% of the variation is explained by these 4 axes. And one thing about this is, you know, as you're taking away the main drivers of what's going on, there's a lot more variation left over. So when you look at these colors here, the lighter colors are earlier years, the darker colors are later years. But also, if you drew a circle around here, you could get a sense of the amount of variation that is in the different regions. And you can see that, you know, Finnmark, which is in Norway, Troms, Nordland, they're pretty tight, whereas regions in Alaska and Russia, there's quite a bit of variation that goes on. And in this the third axis, the third dimension here, the workforce is important. So what percent of your workers are in the goods sector or in the public sector? And so I looked at that, and Alaska, the North Slope here, has, out of all the countries, the highest percent in the goods producing sector. While also within Alaska, you have Wade Hampton, which has the highest percent of employment in the public sector. But you can see there's, you know, it's pretty, in Norway, you know, pretty evenly split, you know, what's going on among the regions, and, you know, about half of the people work in the public sector. So, I mean, the public sector is pretty important in the Arctic. And when you look at the ranking of the public sector, I mean, Wade Hampton is 15% higher than your nearest region in Finnmark and Troms, which are Norway. So Wade Hampton has quite a large public sector, and Norway, North Slope, down at the bottom. So this is going back to the ranks and the things that were driving the MFA analysis and like setting the North Slope apart were goods, income, and fuel purchasing power. You can see how Russia down here is at the bottom with the income and fuel purchasing power. And with the population density, you know, Alaska's down here at the bottom. And Russia and Norway, Iceland are up here at the top. So I was interested in looking at the variation among the different indicators. So what I did was I calculated the coefficient of variation for each of your indicators within each region. And you'll see that a lot of white up towards the top. So there's a lot of variation going on in Russia, and a lot of dark colors on the bottom, which is Norway and Greenland, and Canada, surprisingly, occurs, you know, quite a bit down here. And Alaska's kind of scattered around. But when I did look at the coefficient of variations among the employment sectors, the sector that was the most variable was the goods producing sector overall, and also when I looked at individual region comparisons. I thought migration would be more important in all of this analysis because I've read some stuff from ISER who think that, and the idea is that migration might be a better indicator of economic health within regions. So, and I like that idea. However, there's not much variation in migration. The Arctic in general is losing people. The only areas that had positive migration, and they were barely positive, were Yukon, Northwest Territory, and Iceland. North Slope, so, you know, it's still negative, but there's definitely, I guess, a lowering of the exodus of people from the North Slope, which is interesting. So I wanted to kind of just look more at specifically Alaska and what's going on with Alaska. Participation rates, you can see that the North Slope is much higher than the other regions. I'm not exactly sure why participation really jumped around the year 2000. I don't know if people in here have an idea of why that might happen. But I think it's interesting that the participation rate is kind of holding steady, and with the migration, you have not as many people leaving, which is a good sign. You know, people are staying, in my mind, that says they're kind of staying in the workforce or finding jobs. And public, that one, Wade Hampton, percent employment in the public sector remains high and is actually kind of increasing, whereas the North Slope is kind of going on the opposite trend, slightly decreasing. And unemployment rates, the North Slope is decreasing in the percent of people that are unemployed, but you know, Wade Hampton has been kind of growing. So the diversity just within this state is amazing. So conclusions: the main difference among Arctic demo-economic systems between regions is higher population density, lower natural growth rate, and lower unemployment rate, and those are in Russia, Norway, Iceland, versus some of the more remote and isolated regions in Alaska and Canada. And the North Slope in Alaska stands apart from other North American regions because it has the highest income PPP, fuel purchasing power, employment in the goods sector of all the regions. The goods sector was the most volatile in among the three unemployment sectors overall and within regions. So for 13 out of the 18 regions, when you looked at the three employment sectors, the goods was the most volatile. Demographic indicators such as, you know, migration, population density, and natural growth were important on all four axes. They were at least mentioned. And most of the areas in the Arctic have experienced outmigration. Overall, the average was negative, except for Iceland and 2 regions in Canada. Okay, so that's the information about the social economic paper. And the reason that is part of this research project is because when we go in to do interviews and look at governance and land use, I mean, we want to better understand these social economic conditions. So in 2012 and 2013, we did interviews. I did the interviews here in Alaska. I hired a person at UAF to help me, and then local helpers within the community, and then other people involved in the project did the ones in Russia and Norway and Canada. So we selected the communities, and then we did an interview guide, interviews, analysis and write-up, and follow-up. I'm going over to Norway to do the analysis and write-up. That's kind of where we are right now. And then in the fall, I'm going to travel back to the communities. I've really had to stress to the Norwegians that it's important to follow up with these interviews. And the protocol for doing interviews in the different countries is vastly different. The Norwegians were shocked at how expensive it is to do interviews in Alaska. And it's like, well, it's a big state and you have to travel. You know, air tickets are expensive. So, selection of 28 communities. Again, we focused it on the tundra regions. We wanted to get contrasts within countries, so contrasts with the governance, socioeconomic contrasts, and resource development contrasts. So, like for example, in Alaska, we had regions that have access to the Red Dog Mine and the North Slope. So when I say access to wage income, that would be, is there a resource development around or some other major wage economy? So in Alaska, we chose kind of the 3 census areas. We figured that would be the best way to get contrast in governments, you know, especially with having 3 different regional corporations. So we looked at Nome, Northwest Arctic, and North Slope, and we had Brevig Mission. We had Noatak and Norvik and Atkasuk. And then Russian, the federations were Murmansk, Taimyr, Yamal. And in Norway, the counties and Finnmark. And that's the population size as far as the number of interviews that we did, 64, 194, and 76. Regional differences, kind of looking at between the countries. This is an example of household expenditure in Norway. So the amount of money you spend on food, housing, transport. Obviously here in Alaska, I think your food and your housing would take up a larger chunk of your income. Difference in management approaches. This is the Alaska management system. You have the boards up here, and they're telling people what to do. So it's very top down. Versus this is kind of the Scandinavian system, where you have hunters organizations, farmer unions, smaller scale, local, and then they go up to the boards. When I was in Norway the first time, I spent a lot of time learning about the management, especially moose management system, and it's interesting that you have groups of landowners, because all the land is basically owned, and they come together with their harvest management plan, and they nicely allocate who's going to get the bull, who's going to get the cow, and then they all work together and present it to authorities. It's kind of neat. All right, so originally we had planned on doing 6 communities, 2 in each of the different census areas. However, due to money, and also Uniclete did not want to participate. With doing interviews in Alaska, I told the other countries we need to go to the community first, present it to the tribal council, get permission, and then see if we can do it. And they thought that was kind of funny because they couldn't imagine anyone not wanting to participate in research. But since I was not able due to weather to get in there, I didn't get permission from that community, but that might be something we try in the future. So within region differences, say like within Alaska, some things that I gathered information on, just data that we're going to maybe use, life expectancy, sex ratio, education levels, migration. So this is an example of the age distribution in Brevig Mission and Noatak, and 2000 versus 2010. And Brevig Mission seems to be losing a lot of their elderly population. And I definitely saw that when I went into the community. It was much harder to get elders to be interviewed. So economic differences, wage access, type of employment, poverty rates, prices of fuel, housing, food, and whether there's commercial fishing or hunting. So on the top is Norvik, and on the bottom is Atkasuk. Atkasuk's in the North Slope, and a lot of the oil money funds local government, so much higher percent employment in the local government. Gas prices, even within Alaska, like I mentioned before, there's definitely a difference in gas prices. And when you're going out quite frequently for subsistence harvest, that's going to make a big difference in your money. So the interviews, this was a local hire in Noatak, and this is Doro, who is doing an interview in Russia. So we reviewed the previous interviews, such as the subsistence interviews, SLCA, food security interviews. We got together the people from the various countries and wrote up an interview guide. It's very difficult to make an interview that works in all four countries. Approach the communities, and this process was country specific. I think the most difficult was Canada. The Canadians made the Norwegians actually come over to Canada and present it to their local government, and then it was pretty, hair-raising, nerve-wracking whether they're going to be improved. And then, with Alaska, like I mentioned, have to go there first. And in Russia and Norway, it was just, kind of almost show up. 2 field workers were usually hired, and then 1 to 2 weeks in each community. And interviews is something that I have no training in. So I learned a lot doing this process, and I made sure that I hired a person from UAF who had done interviews to help me, and I really had to, learn from her a lot. But I wished I would have had better training in how to do interviews before I did this. But you have to be flexible and hire good helpers. I did learn that. There was my helper and I were standing one day, and we were going to do this interview, and we look outside, and there the guy goes on his snow machine to go to another village. So it's like, all right, well, we're not interviewing him. Let's find someone else. So. All right, so who did we interview? We tried to go for half men, half women, half young people, half elders, and then leaders and non-leaders. Leaders are considered people who are involved in government, so tribal council leaders, city council, and if we had 2 people who are on the school board. And for a total of 16 people, and we wanted to go after people who are active subsistence users. Originally, I kind of advertised as subsistence hunters, and I learned that that was a very poor choice of words because it excluded a lot of females. A lot of females go out and harvest, gather berries, and go along on the hunting trips, but they wouldn't consider themselves hunters. So it was one of the things I had to change in the process. So interviews, the sections of the interviews, we looked at harvest and land use. So we asked about, how much did you hunt, and we also had a mapping portion where we had people draw their subsistence hunting areas, community dynamics, participation in local government and activities, food security, views on conservation, nature, wildlife. Unlike at least Norway and Russia, we paid the people that we interviewed. They are experts in what they do. So, and hired some local people, and for some of them I did need an interpreter, especially for the elders. So we were able to get a pretty close to what our interview structure was like. The only community we had a little trouble was my first community, which was Norvik, where elder female. We were kind of low on that. So this is an interview background. 64 in Alaska, 194 in Russia. That's because you had 3 different federations and then multiple communities within the federations. Norway, 76, and like I said, the Alaska breakdown was pretty even. So the percent of interviewees that harvest ecosystem services, surprisingly, Alaska had the lowest percent of the interviewees that harvested of subsistence resources. And it was difficult to find elder women who, like I mentioned, would say that they went out and harvested ecosystem services. And this was just in the last year. So we asked them in the last year. And with Norway, like small game hunting is pretty important. And in Russia, people can there's commercial hunting and fishing in Russia, and you can actually have a job as a professional hunter. So there's pictures of like cellars just full of fish and wild animals. I mean, very intensive harvest. What are they harvesting? Alaska, people tend to do more hunting than in the Russian and the Norway regions. But fishing is common, and you have farming, and this includes reindeer herding. In Norway, the places we interviewed, there was Sami people, and also in some of the communities in Russia did reindeer herding. So we took the subsistence surveys, and they have a multiplier in there where you can take the animal and how much edible pounds you get out of it and convert it into weight. This is kind of one of the downfalls. One of the hard things about doing a big project, interdisciplinary work, is communication, and Tundra is supposed to be primarily a land project. So I didn't ask about fish or plants, the quantity, so we just don't have that for Alaska. But again, with Russia, there's the commercial harvest, and you have people who harvest for a living, which is why this is so much higher than the other areas. So when drawing areas on a map, we ask people, what are your top 3 sites? So if oil and gas had to come in and develop an area, where's an area that you would say, hands off, stay away? And then they would circle them on a map. And so within those sites, in Alaska, the most common places were where they hunt ungulates, so caribou and moose. But places that people called their cabins were also pretty important. In Norway, almost everybody has what they call cabins. I say they are second homes because they have satellite dishes on them and internet and are quite nice. But fish in Russia was the dominant area that they would say to protect. So we asked some questions about conservation. So development of the community is more important than wilderness areas. Most people in Alaska strongly agree that they would see their communities being developed versus protecting the wilderness area. That's different than the other areas of Russia. That should go to 100. But I think that's because in Alaska there's just so much wilderness that, yes, you can develop it because it's not really that limited. It's not a scarce resource. And that kind of gets into this question where we asked, should you reduce the use of snow machines in the wilderness areas? People kind of looked at me very weird, and I had to tell them this is an international survey. Some of the questions are going to be funny. But most people don't agree that you should reduce the use of snow machines. But with ATVs in Russia and in Norway, they don't think that they have a purpose, and that's because snow machines are seen as subsistence use for reindeer herding, and where ATVs really don't have a purpose for subsistence in Norway. And in Russia, it's illegal to take your ATV off of a road in Norway. I think I've seen them more on the roads in town than anywhere else. Wildlife management, we asked whether it should be based on local customs and harvesting traditions versus Western science. And most people agree that it should be based on local customs and harvesting traditions. When we went to expert knowledge, people in Alaska tend to say no, have it more based on local customs and harvesting traditions. Russia was half and half. And I think Russia is because there really isn't wildlife management going on there. It's pretty much hands off, and they're trying to reestablish their whole system. So I think with the Russian questions, as we go deeper into this, it's going to be they have maybe an idea of what it should be like, so maybe a more favorable view of what management is because it's just not there. So we asked about predators and kind of predator control stuff, whether predator numbers should be reduced to increase harvesting of resources. And about half the people that I interviewed in Alaska agreed that they should be reduced, slightly more than what you see in Russia or in Norway. And then when you ask about individual animals, whether they think they should be increased, decreased, or just leave them alone, in Norway it's pretty much just leave them alone, except for grouse and Arctic fox that they'd like to see increased. Whereas in Alaska, you still have some green, which is leave it alone, remain as is, but you have more of increase, decrease, so some more manipulation. People really don't like ravens. But there was a general.
Yeah, I was going to say wrong part of the state.
We're having a little conflict in our state, aren't we?
Yeah, but bears and wolves generally decrease, and moose, ptarmigan increase. So I don't have time to go into some of the other interview questions, but as far as wildlife and wildlife management, we asked why do animals decrease? How do you cope when they decrease? What's important to manage? Do you think current wildlife management is doing well or not? We asked them about the federal and we asked them about the state. And do you think tribal government should be involved in wildlife management? And then there was community dynamics, so we asked about trust of various agencies, kind of which agencies are most important for you. How satisfied are you with the services in your community, and kind of how you get your voice heard, so kind of meetings, are you able to go to meetings? And then some food security questions, so if you couldn't get your subsistence foods, how would you, and what do prices of fuel mean for you? So harvest varies greatly among the regions. Alaska harvested more large game animals. Russia, though, overall harvested more pounds. most interviewees were for conservation of nature, but they need to balance them with subsistence needs, so kind of that snow machine versus ATV question. And wildlife management in Russia has been largely absent, so the views may be radically different than what they are in Alaska and Norway. And kind of just lessons learned from interdisciplinary work. This is quite a huge project, and it allows us to, look at a very large picture. We can ask questions with a wider focus and get at more kind of, large-scale issues. And we can increase awareness of other issues. Also, just networking with people I never thought I would be networking with, But some cons are that, teamwork really is necessary. I had to sit down with the economists and have them really explain to me several times participation versus unemployment rates. I've got to, rely on them. And I found that it's good to be more engaged. If you sit back and don't ask the questions and increase the communication, you can end up just kind of running around in circles and talking past each other. So, and it's also, with such a big project, it's easy to become overwhelmed and lack focus. I mean, this project has been going on since 2009, so projects like these take a long time to come in the making and get going. Fortunately for Norway, they have money to keep funding the project because it's kind of behind what it should be, and also they're pretty patient, very patient. And there's a lot of money for us to network and, like, for me to travel, over there and bring other researchers together. So I find you really need to be together and for a while and talking to each other and understanding each other. So in the future, if we do a Tundra 2, maybe include communities in Wade Hampton, include commercial fishing communities, and I'd like to see more of a bottom-up approach. So ask the communities, what would you find interesting? And work those into the interviews instead of coming in and saying, this is what we want to know. And there's this community partnership of self-reliance and sustainability that Terry Chapin and Todd Brinkman are kind of getting up and running, that helps the communities bring their ideas to the academics, to agencies. So more of a bottom-up approach. That's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Someone who knows more can supersede me, but going back to the outmigration and change in participation slide, have you made sure that there wasn't a change in how the enclave people at Prudhoe Bay and Red Dog Mine are counted?
When we looked at these numbers, they were numbers of local people. So if you were a person who, worked at the mine but lived in, say, in Anchorage, you weren't included in this information. So it was, because I asked about that. I told them, like, say on the North Slope.
Well, so you did pin it down?
Yeah.
I figured you had, but I couldn't resist.
Yes.
And the migration is thousands or percent?
Those are migration rates. So I think they are probably percentages. But I would have to look at the data.
And
They can't be 1,000, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
those were just in the census areas, so they weren't you don't have a breakdown of sub-regional?
No, they were the census areas, yep.
Wade Hampton, I'll tell you, with climate change is rapidly changing the dynamics internally in that region. So.
Yeah, within these, you can have drastically different communities acting in very different ways, but all we could get was at the census.
So again, you're confident that the migration, North Slope migration, change from 0 to significant right around 2000 is not an artifact of the way census counts slope workers.
I don't.
Slope, dwellers, if you will.
Yeah, I thought, this is, the time when you see an increase in the oil production, but I think that this is more the money from the oil production is feeding local jobs like your local government and other things, because these are supposed to be local residents. It's not supposed to include migratory workers or workers that live outside of the area.
I know. I just focusing on this sort of very mundane issue of how are these migration numbers being measured, and I'm really not the right person to matter. Matt Berman or Stephanie Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Probably answer that.
And I mean, it's something where I would have to talk to the other to Margaret, who was she and myself did a lot of work in getting these numbers, and we'd have to go back and look at the source and see exactly. But it's supposed to be just based on people who live in those census areas. Yes.
And my question was very similar in the question about how unemployment and participation are measured vis-a-vis part-time, full-time, because so many people have, or seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
So many people who do subsistence and then some kind of seasonal cash,
Mm-hmm.
and then back to subsistence. And it's probably something that's really too hard to capture when you're trying to have this kind of standard data. But I didn't know if there was any of that nuance in there.
There was, I'm trying to remember how we defined it, but there was a line in there about having to be employed so much of the year. So we did define whether, I can't remember if seasonal workers were or not included. I'm thinking they were not included, but it is defined in the paper.
It's one of those weird things because it's how we all define it for
Yeah.
consistency and academic purposes.
Yeah.
May be in direct contrast with how community folk would themselves say, no, I am sufficiently employed,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
given my needs.
Yeah, like you work as a firefighter during the summer, and I have then enough money to last me the rest time of the year. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yes.
Just a couple comments and suggestions for the next time you embark on a 4-year sort of international collection of comparative data. I think in addition to the variables that you collected, one thing that I think would be useful is percent of the population is Aboriginal. And I think that this varies quite dramatically, say, obviously Iceland or the Murmansk, interregionally, the Murmansk region, a high percentage is sort of ethnic Russians, and you go farther east and so on. And I suspect that if you look at the internal dynamics of what are driving all these trends that go along, mm-hmm. I suspect as a hypothesis that the dynamics of those are different for culturally Aboriginal people versus sort of what I call immigrants, mm-hmm. To the region, and so that can be masking different things. Mm-hmm. A second thing, which Steve already alluded to, is in some of these regions, but most particularly in Alaska's North Slope, there's a very high percentage of non-resident workers, mm-hmm. which kind of screw up any kind of economic data. Mm-hmm. I particularly would really be cautious with that observation about the North Slope being goods producing. Uh-huh. And in fact, I think that if you went to the my guess would be if you just focused on the North Slope rural villages, mm-hmm. you would in fact find the highest percentage of government jobs, and that's what you saw actually, mm-hmm. in your Atlasek interview results. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. People they're not in goods producing, mm-hmm. industries; they're in local government. Mm-hmm. So that's another suggestion. Mm-hmm. And I also finally would suggest that if there were some way to measure and I don't know how it would be, some measure of connection to a road and transportation system as another comparable variable. Mm-hmm. Most of our Alaska regions and most of the more remote Russian regions really are sort of large parts of the population are disconnected and have no sort of it's they're much harder places to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas um, in Norway, it's different situation, I think, in some of those parts.
Yeah, migration has definitely been increasing in Russia, but it was mentioned it's not that easy to migrate in Russia because of the vast differences. One thing that I thought, instead of like a population density, like a density per livable area. Because Greenland, it might look very sparsely populated, but it really is actually quite densely populated because everyone's clustered in one area. But I think the connectivity, getting a better measure of connectivity, both for goods coming in and out and also for people migration, is an excellent suggestion. And also, those goods numbers for the North Slope. I asked them several times, how solid are these numbers? Because, a lot of the workers on the North Slope, I've read several of the papers that this ISER's produced, and most of those workers are not from that area, and it's all a trickle-down effect, people being employed in local government. It's not really employment in the goods-producing sector from people who live up there. But, I mean, that's what the data kept telling us.
But I just think that it underscores the actual complexity of these areas, because we have sort of really three kinds of people physically present, and one are and this is still a simplification. One is native people who live there, and because their ancestors lived there and they continue to live there. And a second group is what I personally call immigrants, non-natives, or who come into the region maybe to take a professional job as a school teacher or whatever, and some of them stay and some of them don't. But they're non-natives that are living there, and then you have this actual enclave or workforce that is, and you have this in Russia too, thousands of people who are flying in and out, and they're physically working there, but really don't live there. And these can all be physically present and all mixed in with the aggregate data that you get for these large regions. And that's just the reality of the way it is. So which is the real North Slope? There's the real North Slope is all three.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah. In the back.
I think you already alluded to it, but if you're doing coastal villages in Alaska, ignoring on that food count or the weight, you toss out 50 bowhead wells from the data, and it skews it just a bit.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely.
So if you include marine mammals in the study, then you're going to get an entirely different set of large animals. I think we eat them.
Yeah.
On margin.
Yeah.
Once we start throwing beluga, bowhead, bluebrook, and whatnot, Syrian seal into the mix. And I think too, one of the things that doesn't come across on it nearly as well is, if I were trying to hone in on that four-wheeler question, a part of what I'm looking for is how far out people in a community see the effect of four-wheelers. Because it has although it's become an accepted vehicle in many ways, the consequence of it seems to be pretty significant. Close in, I see more impact for them, and I just don't know that anyone's unpacking it.
Yeah, part of this project is the Norwegians, they took satellite imagery pictures from each of these communities, and they took a picture around the village, and they took a picture, I believe, It's in meters. I'm not good with that system, but they took it away from the village, and it's called Tundrascape, and they did that for all the villages in all the regions, and they are going through the images and putting on anthropogenic I don't know, marks on the landscape, and kind of looking at the amount of development and the amount of anthropogenic effects, and hopefully we couldn't really incorporate it into this project, but that's something that maybe we could bring back to the communities, is these pictures of what's going on around their community, and kind of the effects of development and ATV use, and how far out our cabins, stuff like that, compared to other areas in the Arctic. Yeah.
I wanted to make sure I understood. When you were in the communities, you did a quota sample?
We attempted to get 16 people, yes. So
you selected by age, gender?
Age, gender, and then whether they were involved in government or not involved in government. And when I went in and presented the project to the tribal government, I asked them who would be 2 good local people to hire, and I gave them, a chunk of change, and they also then helped select the interviewees. They knew what the scheme was, and we just kind of like a snowball effect, but we knew what we wanted to get.
So it wasn't a representative sample?
No, some of the communities are bigger than other communities. Like, one of the reasons why maybe a higher percentage of people hunted in Norway and Russia is those communities were bigger. And so you could be more selective and go and find, the elite of the elite hunters.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're working with the tribal governments in the Alaska Native villages. I'm wondering about if you also had any additional folk who might have come from a different perspective within those communities, given you've got communities where there's some pretty significant divide between, and I'm not sure in those, but divides between the tribal government and the village corporation, and perhaps the unspoken leadership, the elders that are known to be leaders even though they don't hold any formal position. Were there any sort of extra folk just to kind of get a check on some of what you were hearing?
Well, in one of the communities, there was fighting going on between the city and the tribal government. So since I was made aware of that, I tried to make sure that I got both sides of the story. So I did try to keep my eye out for that. Yeah. There's a lot of village politics. Yes.
I'll ask the question about whales. That reminded me, were you looking at just direct harvesting of food, or were you looking at food sharing, those sorts of networks as well? Because a lot of elders, I would think, are receiving food from relatives and things like that, so they may be consumers of wild foods, but not necessarily directly harvesting. I was wondering if that counted.
Well, we tried to pick communities that had minimal marine mammal harvests, which is why I was kind of glad that Unaclete wasn't included, because that's a lot of marine harvest. So I did get mapping information about harvest and asking them, if they did harvest seals, but I just didn't get numbers. And then there were food sharing questions, so I did ask, where do you get your subsistence foods from? So I did have a graph in there of food sharing, and it's still extremely prominent in the villages, and surprisingly the most prominent was from non-relatives. A lot of the elders talked about how ptarmigan is especially a gift for the elders, but in like Brevik Mission, which has lost a lot of its elder population, the elders there were kind of disheartened that it's gone down a lot, the food sharing, it was kind of hard to see some of the things I saw. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. From a methodological perspective, do you think that you will reach the same result if you select a representative sample of the population rather than a random selective interview process?
Mm-hmm. What was the question?
When you were answering the question, you said that you have not selected a representative sample of the population.
Mm-hmm.
And that poses a methodological problem because do you think that we can reach the same result if we conduct a typical survey with a representative sample of information?
Yeah, it's gonna, by selecting people who do subsistence harvest, gather subsistence resources, you'll skew the results towards a positive. But I mean, that was what we were supposed to do in all of the countries. So when we're comparing the countries, we're supposed to be comparing similar types of individuals. So the people who harvest on the large side. One thing we weren't able to scale it towards the size of the communities because of the expense of doing interviews. But yeah, when I look at the results, I do have to keep in mind what was our population that we interviewed, and how does that differ, or how is it similar to the rest of the community. Yeah.
Well, I think it's also a matter of how the data are going to be used to inform the larger study as well, right? So what role does that particular data set play in the larger study where you're looking at the questions of governance and its impacts?
Yeah, I mean, with the governance questions, looking at, we were interested in whether people perceive that they have more or less power if they're involved in government or not. And, I think just that government, we really wanted to get the influence of government on how people function in the communities and how they use the land and their perspectives. So, yeah.
And so the qualitative data might have been the better choice in that scenario. Then. I don't know, but I'm just suggesting.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'd ask the reverse question too, about the lack of governance almost in Alaska as far as participation in governance because of the conflicts with the regional corporations and the village corporations and the tribes, and then resource management planning, while federal agencies and state agencies are just creating plans for land use, and tribes are kind of ghost in the background, and there's not really a direct communication structure. So that's a question there in the reverse, I guess I'd ask. Are we able to look at that in the future, or is that something that's a little too complicated when it comes to land use and subsistence and government?
I think this governance thing is kind of, I think it has a European origination, because over there's a lot of governments, there's a lot of NGOs, and there's a lot of hands-on and people involved in various organizations. I was really surprised. I come from a wildlife management, wildlife biology background, and I've worked with Fish and Game and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a lot, so I just kind of assumed everyone would know what they are. But I was shocked at how many people have no idea of the state, the feds, and we just live on the land and try and, survive.
Or get the two confused.
See
that a lot in Southeast Alaska. People think that Fish and Game is part of Fish and Wildlife Service, or that the state troopers are part of Fish and Game. Sometimes there's not a real clear understanding of, it's just government.
Yeah.
Well, it's not even just not a clear understanding. It's that the regulatory structure is so
complicated
and undecided. We really still haven't figured it out.
People are mostly worried about getting their firearms and ammunition and snow machines taken away, and try and do what they can so that doesn't happen. Right. But also, get their food.
Well, I think we better wrap it up. We've gone over time, but I just want to thank Jen so much for coming.